I'm just going to read, I'll skip over the part where she thanks me for obvious reason. This is our kickoff celebration for Asian American Studies. I don't know if I mentioned this, I've been here since '95, so it's really amazing. We started off, I remember when we started off in Asian American Studies, literally that first year, we were in the trailer complex. I had 4 different offices my first 4 years. I vividly remember putting a flyer saying, you know, come be an Asian American Studies minor. I wanted to mention also that the reason I was here was in part hired as a new professor in 1995 was because of what happened with Professor Nguyen's generation. And I realize I've been referring to her as twin all this time, but she's Professor Nguyen, you know, because respect and stuff like that. But she has a lot to say. And it's actually because of the skate movement, the struggle for ethnic studies. I don't know if you know this, but there was a rotating hunger strike. That was why the 2 lines for me and Clara Kim, that's why we came in 1995. Now, Judy says also, we recently learned that the UCI Asian American Studies Department has been authorized for a 4+1 program. Woohoo! Yay! This is a big deal. This allows our students to spend 1 more year at UCI and receive their master's. Basically, you do the major for 1 more year, you get the master's. We are the only 4+1 program in the country. If you would like to learn more about this opportunity, she says, please let me know. You can talk to me, you can talk to Professor Wu. I also want to thank our generous co-sponsors for the Homescapes, Warscapes 2530 series. That's what this is part of. This is the whole kickoff for celebrating Asian American Studies in the Southeast Asian Archives. The list is long, but for today's purpose, I will just highlight the Humanities Commons and the Southeast Asian Archives. It is a great honor to welcome to UCI. Okay, here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fujita-Roney. I actually teach at Cal State Fullerton with Professor Fujita-Roney's partner, so I get to work with a great team of people. Let me see how.
Yeah, I'm the one without the mustache. So, okay, how do you, this is, yeah, sorry.
So I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. It's been sort of a homecoming for me coming onto this campus. I was a student here just like you about 20-something years ago, and the campus has changed so much. I remember being here when the Student Center wasn't built yet, and we actually had classes that were held over across the street at the Edward Cinema. So that's just how old I am. But I was asked today to talk a little bit about my personal journey in going to UCI and participating in the UCI Asian American Studies protests at that time. And also, I believe there are some health science students in here, is that correct? Can I get a show of hands? How many of you are pre-health? Some sort of...
Don't be shy, come on, loud and proud. How many of you are pre-health?
Yeah, so I was actually trained in public health at UCLA, and so I'll be talking a little bit about my health background. And this is mobile. Thank you.
You want me to put it on the slide?
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. So just so I can get a sense of people in the class, how many of you are freshmen? Okay, a few. Sophomores? A lot. Juniors? And seniors? Super seniors? Great. All right, so I was actually a student here in 1990 through 1995, and I majored in biology and comparative literature. I was a double major, and biology was sort of for my parents, so I'll go into a little bit about my family's history and background and talk a little bit how I got involved into Asian American Studies. So I was born in Vietnam, and I came here at a very young age. Can you guess where I am in the picture here? Any guesses? Don't be shy. Orange dress? Good guess, but no. What? The blue shirt baby? Yeah, that's me. I'm the baby. So I didn't have a lot of hair, and I looked like a boy, so my parents sort of dressed me up in boys' clothes and But I was born in Vietnam, and right before the war, the Vietnam War ended. And when the Vietnam War ended, my parents decided to immigrate to the United States. And this was not an easy journey. I was actually with my mom when, right after the war ended in 1975, I was about 3 years old, and my dad was sent to a concentration camp. And he was there for about a year. And during that time, my mom, who's a pharmacist, she had taken all of the medicine and drugs in her pharmacy and sort of hid them away from the communists. They came and took away her pharmacy. They basically took a lot of businesses away when they took over power in Vietnam. And she had the foresight to actually save some of those medicines and sell it on the black market. And that's how she was able to support our family while my dad was in the concentration camp. You had a question?
So you guys were part of the French Vietnam?
We were part of the South Vietnam. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Vietnam War, right, the communist government took over the South government at the fall of Saigon in 1975. And that spurred an exodus of refugees to come out of Vietnam, and my family was part of that exodus. So during this time, my parents, my mom was trying to make plans to leave Vietnam, and it's a very dangerous journey. You have to basically leave secretly. You cannot let the government know because they will arrest you, or even worse, some people were killed. And it was a very dangerous journey that involved a lot of planning. My parents decided to go by boat, and they had to pay 2 bars of gold per person. And back then, gold was something that was very precious. It still is. But because of the currency changes with the new government, a lot of people kept jewelry and gold as part of their wealth. And my mom was able to save up money by selling drugs on the black market. So I kind of sometimes kid with her. I tell her, "You were a drug dealer?" She doesn't like that joke. But as you can see here, if you look at the picture on the right top corner, there's the Vietnamese flag. That was the Southern Vietnamese flag before the communists took over. When the communists took over, the flag changed to what is now the red flag with the yellow star. And so if you look at a lot of these pictures, some of these pictures, my parents actually cut out the flag because they didn't want the communists to associate them with the South Vietnamese army because they would have been jailed. And so, like I said, my mom was a pharmacist at that time, and this was taken during New Year's. Those are my grandparents. And my mom's pharmacy was taken over when the communists took over. But she was able to save money. She had a lot of resources. And with that money, she was able to buy a trip for us on a boat. And we snuck out in the middle of the night. I remember being woken up, and my parents said, "Wake up, we're going to go to the beach, get dressed." And at that age, I was about 6 years old. I didn't quite know what was going on. I thought, "Oh, we're going to the beach in the middle of the night, awesome," right? But I didn't know the gravity of the situation that my parents were undertaking. And they were basically preparing for us to escape the country. And these boats, as you can see, they're not your typical cruise ships, right? When I tell my students that I came over by boat as a refugee, sometimes they picture these gigantic cruise ships. But obviously, these are not those. These were very small, very fragile fishing boats a lot of times. The captains of these boats didn't know where they were going many times, and they would put hundreds of people on these boats. The boat that I was on was about 300 meters, and it had over 300 people on that boat. And so it was a very crowded boat. And we were on the seas for about 6 days and 6 nights, and on the 7th day, we landed in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, we stayed in a camp there for about 6 months before we were sponsored over to America. While we were at the refugee camps, these are some pictures of some of the refugee camps. This one, I believe, is in Indonesia. This one is in Hong Kong. And my story comes full circle when I came to UCI, because I actually went back and volunteered in these refugee camps. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But as you can see, there was not much privacy. The refugee camps were very crowded. Families of 4, 5, 6 would be crammed into these little bungalows in these little cramped spaces. And that was basically your life for however long you were going to be there. And luckily, my family, we came, it's just me and my younger brother, my parents. We arrived in Indonesia and we were there for about 6 months before we were sponsored over to America. And during those 6 months, I learned a little bit of Indonesian. So Professor Fujito Roni your family is from Indonesia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sumatra.
So, yeah. So this is something that a lot of people don't realize. Many of the what they call a third asylum countries were able to sponsor these refugees and took shelter for them when they escaped from Vietnam. And you've probably heard stories, you've probably seen movies of refugees escaping by boat and also by land through the jungles and so forth. And it was a very dangerous journey that oftentimes involved a lot of illnesses. People were bitten by leeches when they swam across the jungles, rivers. Many people drowned. Some people were preyed on by pirates on the high seas because many people knew that refugees were escaping from Vietnam and bringing a lot of valuables with them. And so they preyed on these refugees and would rob them at high seas and take all their valuables away. Many women were raped, many were killed, many died from starvation. And so it was a very, very dangerous journey. And my dad, being a dentist, he actually had the foresight to drill a hole in my mom's tooth to put her diamond in her tooth. And she also sewed a diamond into her bra, into one of her bras. And when she came to Indonesia, she was able to sell one of the diamonds, and that's how they got money to survive. And she gave the other diamond to me for my wedding. So it's something that reminds me of the sacrifices, right, that my parents went through to get us to America. So when we arrived in Virginia, it was right in the middle of winter and during Christmas time. And so there was snow, the first time I ever saw snow, and we celebrated Christmas, and I thought, oh my goodness, America is the greatest country on earth, right? Little did I know that my parents had to go through so much in order to get us there. And I came in, I was supposed to be in the 2nd grade, but I was put back 1 grade, and I didn't know any English. I didn't know anything about America, and I was basically thrown into the 1st grade when I came here. And for that whole year, I remember not raising my hand, not participating, not saying anything. But I had a wonderful teacher who really was encouraging, and she was this Caucasian lady who worked with me after school every day. And after a year of working with her, I was able to skip the 2nd grade and go into the 3rd grade. And I was in ESL during that whole time, trying to learn English. And luckily, I was able to learn English and succeed. And after a year in Virginia, my parents decided to move to California because they felt that there were more opportunities here in California. So we arrived in Tustin and eventually moved to Monterey Park. Any of you are from Monterey Park here? A few? So if you know anything about Monterey Park, this is a very predominantly Chinese community, and there were a lot of different businesses that were opening up at that time during the early 1980s. And I remember just being really struck by how different Monterey Park was from Virginia, right? I had maybe one friend. I was one of 2, perhaps, students in Virginia who were Asian American. And when I came to Monterey Park, practically everyone was Asian American. And so it was a big shocker for me, but I think it helped me to adapt very quickly to this environment as well. And eventually, my parents went back to school. So my parents, when they were in Vietnam, my dad was a dentist, my mom was a pharmacist. But of course, when you come to America, you can't necessarily pick up from where you left. They had to go back to school, take all the exams, take all the prerequisites, and eventually they were able to get their licenses. And during this time, my mom, she would work cleaning people's houses to support my dad through school. And my dad would also take side jobs as a gardener, cut people's lawns. And I remember they would come home really tired, and my dad had cuts on his fingers, right, from gardening. And my mom would just be sore and cleaning people's houses and their toilets and floors. And so it really instilled in me this sense of how important my parents' sacrifices were for my education. They basically left Vietnam because they wanted a better future for my brother and me. If we had stayed in Vietnam, we probably would not have been able to go to school because we didn't belong to the communist government. And so my parents growing up instilled in us all the time how important education was. And we really followed this model minority myth, right? Everything was about education. It was always about, you got to study. You got to go to school and study and get better grades and get straight A's and A pluses, right? So this model minority concept of having Asian American students in particular always excelling was something that I experienced growing up very, very much so. And I think I started to break out of my shell starting in high school because I grew up loving to watch basketball, and I would watch this was back when the Lakers and the Bulls were great rivals, and I loved watching basketball games, and I decided to just go out for the basketball team. And can you see where I am in the picture? Yeah, I'm the one holding the ball in the middle. And I was the shortest person on the team. I was about 4'11" when I was in high school. I grew 1 inch when I got to college, so I'm 5 feet now. But I was the shortest person on the team, but I was the best shooter, and I worked really, really hard. And I started out in Frosh Sov, eventually moved on to junior varsity, and by my senior year, I was in varsity on the varsity girls basketball team. And I got a lot of heartache from my parents for joining the basketball team because they said, why are you joining the basketball team? It has nothing to do with your studies. You need to focus more on your education. And I told them, I enjoy this. This is something that I really love doing, and it makes me who I am. And I think that's when I first really started to break out and think about following what my heart told me to do. And basketball is something that has stayed with me. Now my kids are in basketball, and I still try to play the game whenever I can. But I went to University High School, just down the road. And it was a great experience because I made a lot of friends. I wasn't the typical really active student necessarily who was involved in ASB or any of that, but basketball was what I really, really enjoyed. And it got me through high school, and when I got to college, I decided to major in biology and follow what my parents had asked me to do. So they wanted me to become either a dentist or a pharmacist, right? Because that's what they did, that's what they knew. And they said, major in biology, you will always have a stable job. This is something that we want you to do. And so I followed their directions and came into UCI. I wanted to actually go to UC Berkeley. That was my first choice. And my mistake was I took my dad on a tour of the campus. And when he came through the co-ed dorms, he said, you're not going here. There's no way. So unfortunately, I didn't get to UC Berkeley, but I did get to UCI, and I don't regret any moment of it. And so when I came to UCI, at that time, they did not have an Asian American Studies department. They actually had only 2 courses that were offered in Asian American Studies that was taught by Dr. John Liu. And I had taken an introduction to humanities class. How many of you have to do that still as part of your GE? Yeah? Yeah, so that was something that was required, and I didn't know anything about the humanities, but I took a class and fell in love with it and started taking more literature classes. and became more in love with this field of English and comparative literature. So I decided to double major in comparative literature and biology. And I didn't tell my parents. But during this time, I got really involved in a lot of clubs and organizations on campus. And I started joining a club called Project Pearl. This was a club that helped to do advocacy work to get refugees in the camps, in the refugee camps, to be sponsored over to a third country for resettlement. And during my freshman year, that summer, I went on a fact-finding trip to Southeast Asia, and I traveled throughout Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, and I went and visited all of these different refugee camps. And it really changed entirely my whole view of the world. And I would highly, highly encourage you, if you get a chance to go and study abroad, if you get a chance to do any sort of community projects, get really actively involved, do it, right? Because it will change your perspective of really what privilege you have, right? As students here at UCI, you are part of the cream of the crop, right? And this really opened my eyes when I went to the camps. It opened my eyes to the disadvantages that other people have, that I have so much privilege in my life, and I have the resources to be able to help some others who are not as advantaged, right? So this was when I started also taking Asian American Studies classes, and I'm sure you'll be learning more about that in this class. But the Asian American Studies movement started in the late 1960s, right, at San Francisco State in 1968. And it was students just like you who made the call and instigated protests in order to demand Asian American Studies. And we here at UCI during that time, I was part of the Asian Pacific Student Association. We had a lot of activities, a lot of workshops, trying to advocate for an Asian American Studies program on campus, because at that time, like I said, there were 2 classes that were being offered. And we felt we wanted to know more about our heritage, about our background. We wanted to see more classes that talked about our histories. And so we started organizing and really started educating ourselves and learning about social justice issues. What were other campuses doing? What were they doing to advocate for Asian American Studies? And we started organizing. And like Dr. Virginia said earlier, we came up with the idea of holding a hunger strike, a rotating hunger strike. And we decided to camp out in front of the administration building. So I'll go back to this. I'm going to show you a video during that time of the protest. And it'll give you a better sense of, hopefully, what we were involved in during that time. But it took a lot of organizing, a lot of coordination. Am I in the right folder? Do you know how to pull up the DVD? So this DVD was done by a friend. I don't quite remember who made it, but it's a homemade video that was recorded of the protests during the time the student protests were going on. And this was happening during a very volatile time when the Rodney King verdict had just come out, right? And so there was a lot of unrest. And it's really amazing that 25 years later, a lot of these issues are still pertinent today, right? Black Lives Matter, all of the police killings, and all of the brutality against communities of color. This was all happening during that time as well, during the early 1990s. And so we decided to get together, organize this rotating hunger strike, and we decided to gather students to storm the administration building. And there were hundreds of students who came out to support us during that day. We had performances, we had speakers, we had all kinds of strategies, slogans. You'll see in the video that some of the things that we talked about was the past is in our hearts, but the future is in our minds, right? We came up with great slogans like world class my ass, excuse my French. But at that time, UCI was really gaining in prominence, and they were touted by US News and World Report as one of the world-class universities of the world. And yet here we were with 44% Asian American studies, Asian American students on campus, but we only had 2 Asian American studies courses and no department, no program whatsoever. And so students, as part of APSA, really organized, and this is some of the coverage during that time.
But another school official says the university wants to establish the program, but there's just no money available right now.
We are all here in agreement with the need for an Asian American studies program. There is no question about that need. I think the question, and this is the difficult part, the question is how quickly can this be accomplished under the current budgetary constraints?
Earlier, several hundred students rallied outside of the administration building.
Right now, we're currently 43.4% Asian American, and we don't have an ethnic studies program. That's ridiculous. All the other schools in the UC have it, but we don't have it, and we're the largest percentage-wise Asian American student population here on the continental U.S. It's ridiculous that UCI does not have an Asian American studies program.
Currently, the school offers 2 Asian studies classes, and several community leaders joined students Thursday to pressure administrators for more.
We are here today to support them, to show that we care, and we want to put as much leverage as we can on the administration to assist them to get some kind of program started beyond what, for the last few years, they call the Asian American Studies program.
Acting Chancellor Smith has promised to provide 2 more faculty positions, but the students say they'll keep pushing for a complete program.
Have more Wi-Fi.
During that time, in order to add classes, you actually had to still put in paper slips. They didn't have computers as they do now. Gosh, it sounds so old. I wanted to show you students serving the administration. gives you a little bit of the taste of what went on during that time. It's very different from the concept of the model minority, right? And I think being involved in those protests and being involved in that advocacy work during that time really opened up my eyes to the power of students like you and what kind of voices and really impact you can have if you organize and coordinate and go after something that you want, right? So I really wanted to show that video because it also destroys a lot of the misconceptions that we often have about Asian American communities of being silent and quiet and not rocking the boat, right? So this was something where not only Asian American Studies students participated in, but the whole entire campus was involved. And the students organized and really collaborated across ethnic lines, across all kinds of different majors and backgrounds to really put this protest together. And it was something that made an impact because now you have the Asian American Studies department here on campus, right? So I really want you to challenge yourselves and think about what role does your education have in the whole context of your communities, right? Why are you here? Why are you taking this class? Do you want to just come out, get a degree, get a stable job, right? Which is great, which is needed, and which is why a lot of us go into education and get a degree, right, to get that job. But beyond that, what drives you? What gets you up in the morning, right? What motivates you? And for many of us, it's about doing service and really paying back a lot of what we learn. And I think, again, being in this privileged position that you're in as students here at UCI, you have so much power, so much ability to make an impact in your communities. And I always tell my students that really, if you think about it, this is the only time in your lives where you have a chance to explore your interests and what you want to do in life. Never again will you really get a chance to, be in this environment where for many of you, you may be working, but you're in an environment where you're actively learning every single day, right? And with classes growing in size, with classes costing more, it's hard for a lot of people to get access to education. So you being here in this privileged position, what will you do with this education? And for me, I really struggled growing up trying to fulfill my parents' expectations of what they wanted me to be and what I wanted in my own heart. And I think growing up and going through the experiences that I did and trying to break out of my shell and following my heart, being involved in advocacy work, and really looking back at UCI and the time here, I don't necessarily remember the classes necessarily that I was in, but I remember the experiences outside of class. I remember the experiences being involved in the protests, working with other students to organize, and going to volunteer in the camps, right? And so what will you take with you after your time here at UCI? And I really want to encourage all of you to think about this idea of compassion and empathy, and think about what can you do to spread more compassion in your communities. And empathy is really about putting your shoes in another person's, putting your feet in another person's shoes, right? And really thinking about what can you do that may not benefit you individually, but may be for the greater good of the communities that you work in. So I wanted to end with some quotes by Yuri Kochiyama. How many of you know who Yuri Kochiyama is? Really? Actually, this is
quarter, it's okay.
no, this is actually, I did not know who Yuri Kochiyama was when I started here as a student. And so I'm glad that you're taking a class like this because you will learn about Yuri, I'm sure. And Yuri was actually a human rights activist, I would call her, and she worked alongside very closely with Malcolm X. She was actually the one who held him as he lay dying after he was assassinated. And she worked throughout her life. She passed away a few years ago in her 90s. But she worked throughout her life for causes that really benefited the greater good. And during the civil rights movement, you often hear about Martin Luther King, you hear about Rosa Parks, you hear about Cesar Chavez. But it's very rare that you hear about Asian American activists during that time. And Yuri Uchiyama was one of those activists. And she said, our ultimate objective in learning about anything is to try to create and develop a more just society. Life is not what you alone make it. Life is the input of everyone who touched your life and every experience that entered it. We are all part of one another, right? So she really emphasizes this idea of interconnectedness and that idea of compassion and empathy for others who are not perhaps as privileged as us, and really putting that education to good use, right? So thank you, everyone, and I'm really honored to be here and I look forward to meeting you.
Professor Wu just handed me the microphone and said to introduce Karen, and I was like, I think we can launch right in. Can you guys do a quick self-introduction? We're so honored to have her here. We were just talking about, we were trying to figure out when we had met, because I've been in the field since, well, professionally since '86, so I know over the years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, Dorothy, and thank you too for going on first. I appreciate that. I was like wandering around the campus. Oh my God. Put that up. Oh, okay. Anyway, I want to thank Judy especially for inviting me today, and it's quite an honor, as Tu Yuan said, to be here. I'm going to be giving my age away, but no surprise there. When I was an undergrad in the late 60s, there was no such thing as Asian American Studies. History and culture of Asians in the US was basically a DIY project. We had to figure it out and find our own resources. So from my point of view, all y'all are just very lucky to have books and the faculty, including the tests and the papers, so that finding out about our history is not such a grueling project. So, how do I get there? Just push it. Oh, this way. Okay, so not only was there no Asian American Studies when I was an undergrad, there was no such thing as an Asian American. Rather, we were Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, the ethnic groups at that time that constituted the majority of Asians in the US. By 1970, 80% of Japanese Americans had been born here in the US, and 50% of Filipino and Chinese. So as this map shows, that Japanese, Chinese, and Filipinos lived in every state of the Union by 1970. But regardless, we were not seen as Americans, but lumped together as Orientals. And during this war in Southeast Asia, not only were we considered Orientals, we looked suspiciously like the enemy. During the 60s, when social change was happening around the world, we realized two major things. We, as separate Asian ethnic groups, were overlooked and ignored. And assimilation not only didn't work, it was no longer the goal. So, pushed by the Vietnam War, a racist war against people who look just like us, and pulled by the promise of a third world that called for self-determination versus assimilation, Asians throughout the US came together to form a political identity of Asian Americans in order to be seen and heard. So So my talk today is going to explore how the Vietnam War engendered a specifically Asian American analysis of the war and how it was a critical dynamic in developing the political identity of Asian Americans. So I'm going to go through some of the major elements of what constituted an Asian American anti-war stance. Looking like and being considered the enemy, racially then identifying as the enemy with the enemy, seeing the war as a recurrent history of US oppression on Asians, and supporting indigenous solutions like the 7-point peace program rather than American solutions such as the Vietnamization of the war. This was the cover of the 1972 issue of Ghidra. It was called the Monthly of the Asian American Experience. It was the foremost newspaper of the Asian American movement that lasted pretty much from 69 to 74. It was created by this amazing artist, Alan Takamoto, and it shows a white officer ordering an Asian American soldier to kill that gook. You gook. And here, the international intentional reiteration of the term gook describes an idiosyncratic subject position that became inescapable for Asian Americans during the 60s. While most standard dictionaries list the origin of the term gook as unknown, the use as a racial epithet is inarguably led to the U.S., tied to the U.S. military. It was first used in reference to Filipinos during the Philippine-American War, and during the Korean War, gook referred to North and South Koreans as well as Chinese. So by the Vietnam War, gooks became an epithet that generally and uncritically associated persons of Asian ethnicities with the enemy. So one of the first articles to document this phenomenon was by Norman Nakamura, who had recently just completed a tour in Vietnam in 1970. And his article detailed rampant racist attitudes that were heaped upon Vietnamese women, children, and the elderly, in addition to the official enemy, which was at that time the North Vietnamese soldiers. He wrote that generalized disrespect and mistreatment of Vietnamese was the norm, that soldiers were taught that no Vietnamese could be trusted, and that even South Vietnamese soldiers were not dependable. They were told that the land is not populated by people, but by gooks. So as this political cartoon asserts, the catch-22 of looking like the enemy was even extended to American soldiers fighting on the front line. In 1971, the Vietnam Vets Against the War sponsored a 3-day event called the Winter Soldier Investigation. And 125 vets and civilians, but mostly vets, attested to the imperialistic and racist nature of the events that they committed or were witness to. And former Marine Mike Nakayama testified that during basic training, he was told to stand up, turn around so everybody could see you. To the rest of the men, the drill instructor announced, "This is what a gook looks like." Within a year, Mike would be awarded a Bronze Star and wounded twice. The second time he was shot, he lay in a dirty cot in a military hospital in Da Nang with open chest wounds and shrapnel in his skull. Realizing that other US soldiers were being treated for him, he managed to utter, "Hey man, when are you going to deal with me?" The answer, "Oh, you speak English? Why didn't you tell us you were an American? We thought you were a gook." So Nakayama's experience was not unique. Scott Shimabukuro also testified at the Winter Soldier Investigation. He said, "When I went into the Marine Corps, I thought I was going to serve my country and be a brave Marine and a good American. As I stepped off the bus at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, the drill instructor came up to me and said, 'Oh, we have a gook here today in our platoon.'" So both Scott and Mike linked the racism they experienced in the military to the racism their families and communities experienced at home. Ironically, Scott's father was a World War II veteran and a member of the segregated 442nd Regional Combat Team during World War II. And that was the most decorated unit of its size in US history. And his father insisted that there was no more racism in America because, he maintained, we won the right to be Americans. I fought for you to be an American. So as they talked about the racism back home, sure enough, the vets brought the war home. In his article, GI Racism, Norman Nakamura noted, quote, frustration and racism have made racist bullies of many GIs in Vietnam. But will it end in Vietnam, or will it color a negative stereotype toward all Asians? He speculated that for some GIs, this was their first contact with Asians, so it was highly unlikely that this experience would not affect them. In March 13th, 1972, Time magazine, there was an article called The Violent Vets that reported the violence perpetrated by veterans after they came home. So you can see that underneath the photo, the caption reads, hatred for the group. And then the article went on to say that at least twice a veteran indulged his hatred for groups by attacking a waiter in a Chinese restaurant, and said that veterans, and the article concluded that the veterans of other wars were, of course, also trained to be killers, but the readjustment for Vietnam vets was worse because they brought this preconceived notion of what all Asians look like, and of course we all were about, and we all look alike. So other examples of anti-Asian violence by veterans, at the Winter Soldier investigation, both Scott and Mike testified that they had friends who were beaten up because they were mistaken for Vietnamese. In 1970, a Los Angeles Times article reported that 2 Japanese college students studying in the US were attacked and beaten by 2 Vietnam veterans who shouted, "We just got back from fighting you communists in Vietnam." So PTSD, yes, undoubtedly. But in his article, Norman Nakamura also indicated that the racist behavior was not only sanctioned, but taught by the US military. Therefore, the GIs generally felt morally exonerated of responsibility of guilt, culturally and physically superior to the Vietnamese, and also they were basically officially immune from reprimand or punishment. So I think one of the most horrific examples of both of these. Okay. We're running out of time. I'm going to go very fast. But one of the most horrific examples was the murder of a 17-year-old Southeast Asian honor student in Queens. She was brutally murdered, raped, sodomized, strangled, and the predator was a Vietnam vet. According to the defense attorney, the killer had done what he was trained to do, and he was ultimately released as found not guilty by reason of insanity. A second factor in the Asian American analysis of the war is that we began to identify with Vietnamese. As baby boomers, we had literally grown up and come of age with the Vietnam War. In 1973, Bruce Iwasaki, who's now a Superior Court judge, said, "The U.S. involvement in Vietnamese affairs began around the time we were born, stayed hidden from the national consciousness during our years of innocence, escalated as we matured, and has reached climactic proportions while our generation gains the will and seeks the means to end that involvement." So Elaine Kim, who was another Asian American studies professor, said that because we had been historically identified by race, it was difficult for many of us not to respond to the racial character of the war in Vietnam. So we began to see our sameness. So this is a cover of Kalayan International, and basically, as it says, as you can see, it says, "Stop killing our Asian people." So So here you have, Filipinos, it's a Filipino paper, considering Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians as our Asian people. So you can see how there is a developing political identity as Asian Americans. The third theme in an anti-Asian war discourse was the recurring history of U.S. oppressions of Asians. So you can see on here that Stop Genocide was one of the placards in the back. So war was seen as just another episode in a prolonged history of racism against Asians. One thing in a article about the Philippine American War, which was at the turn of the century, there was an article indicating that the extermination of Filipinos, prisoners and captives, sounded eerily like a report from the Vietnam War. World War II was another flashpoint in the history of racism against Asians. And the commemoration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reminded people, U.S., that the atomic past was the genocidal present. So the last element in the Asian American anti-war stance was really support for Vietnamese goals and strategies. So while fighting unjust war, like other anti-war activists, Asian American activists had substantive differences with the mainstream anti-war movement with regard to underlying values and tactics in both tone and substance. Rather than just appealing for peace and an end to the war, Asian Americans adopted Vietnamese goals of self-government and an end to imperialistic interference, specifically the support of the 7-point peace program of the PRG of South Vietnam. This cover So this is a PRG peace program. This cover of Gitra in 1970 graphically conveys an Asian American support for the Vietnamese. You can see that it features a Southeast Asian mother holding a baby, a rifle, and also Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. And the caption reads, "We will fight and fight from this generation to the next." So skipping right ahead, it really is all these ways that the Asian American analysis of the Vietnam War strengthened an Asian American political identity. So as I mentioned that Elaine Kim was right on point when she noted that having been historically defined by race, it was difficult not to respond to the racial nature of the war in Vietnam. And she added that our self-invention as Asian Americans was basically stimulated in opposition to U.S. aggression in Southeast Asia. And then law professor and activist Chris Ijima also asserted that the construction of Asian American identity was a mechanism and also byproduct of Asian Americans organizing in the 60s. Therefore, he emphasized that the development of a distinctly Asian Pacific American identity was never meant to be a synonym for common heritage or even racial pride. It was recognition of this dynamic that marked the beginning of Asian American identity. So as Asians in America, we were fighting for self-determination at the same time as people who looked like us in Vietnam were fighting for their lives. As Asian Americans, we were moved and motivated by the relentless determination of the Vietnamese people. With racial baggage of being Americans, but not seen as such, incited by the war and inspired by a vision of the third world, Asians in the U.S. subverted the Orientalist tactic of lumping all Asians together in order to form a deliberately pan-Asian and adamantly American political identity. So I'd like to end with this quote from Judge Bruce Iwasaki, which he wrote in 1973. "The Vietnamese have stripped the emperor's clothes. We must spread the news. They have opened our eyes to our genocidal past, our bloody present, and future potential of our own liberation by forcing us to see what we really are. Vietnam's revolution lets us seize the possibility of our own." Thank you.
both of our wonderful speakers, and just a few words. We wanted to leave some time for Q&A. It was looks like you that when I started doing Asian American Studies in the early '80s, I was really trained by the folks who'd gone through those activist movements, Basic Workshop, everyone there. I also wanted to mention Professor Nguyen actually does. She didn't talk about her current work so much, but she's still working really hard for Southeast Asian American and other communities. She's working in the field of cancer. And so she is doing so much important work in public health. We have about 3 minutes for questions, and so I'm going to pass it to Judy Wu.
I want to thank Professor Giovanni for helping us stage this event. There are 2 speakers. Don't run, you guys. We have 5 more minutes for this class. So I'd like to invite Professor Nguyen to come up, and also Dr. Shizuke to come up as well. And we want to ask you to ask questions. Most of you, I assume, were born in the 90s, maybe in the 2000s. So I think a lot of things that they've been talking about might be very foreign and strange for you. So we're interested in your questions, reactions.
Hi, Dr. Nguyen. So when you're talking about the hunger strike,
the hunger strike. So I think it was the vice president who said that they couldn't do an Asian American Studies program because they didn't have enough money. So how do they find the money?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, if you didn't hear, how did they find the money to fund Asian American Studies? And you saw in the video, Horace Mitchell was the vice chancellor at that time. He said that there was no funding, and that's a common argument a lot of times when there are budget crises, economic crises. Ethnic studies is usually the first, one of the first programs to be on the chopping block or at threat of being chopped. And I think that's a common argument. There's always money that you can find. So because of the pressure of the student protesters, they found the money. And we also did some fundraising, but there's money in the administration, and I think it's a matter of where do you allocate those resources, right? And there's people making decisions at the top that need to hear from students, from people who are getting an education, right? So, yeah.
Any other questions? I'm not averse to going into the crowd and picking people. Volunteers, questions?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to ask, how soon after the protest did you guys think that Asian American Studies?
The question was, how soon after the protest did we get an Asian American Studies program in place? So the protest was in the 1990, so this is the 25th anniversary of Asian American Studies, so 1992. And I believe it was not until 1995 when Dr. Fujita Roni was one of the first hires, along with Claire Kim. And so it took 3 years for it to happen. But during that time, it took a lot of advocacy work with students coming after us as well, continuing that fight. And so at first we hired Dr. Fujita Roni and Claire Kim, and then later on Dr. Linda Vo came. And maybe you can talk. Right, yeah. So it took a few years. So it doesn't happen overnight.
Yep, we're into our 2nd generation of leadership here. I'm one of the old hangovers. So.
Another question. What about reactions? Were you surprised by the students protesting and chanting? Yeah? Anybody else? One last question, and you're free to go.
I have a comment. I work at a senior living center, and a lot of them happen to be vets. And I was just like, when you were talking about how some of them have like a little bit of racism ingrained in them from the military, I can see that because I'm only one of 2 Asian Americans working at the center, so it's really interesting.
Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So she was saying that she works at a senior center where she works with a lot of veterans who do have racism to them.
Okay, I'm sorry. I have otosclerosis, which is a hearing defect, so I wasn't able to quite. So you're working with veterans, and you can see that they have a lot of baggage. Yeah, I think, it's such a tough thing. It's such a tough thing. Because they were basically victims, and taught these things and taught to comply with the military, which, was over their heads. So, even the vets that I mentioned, some of them were very, very street smart. And one of them said to me, if someone sort of said that to me on the street, they would have been leveled. But, they are under the power of the military. So, I don't know about a lot of the efforts, but PTSD, I think, is getting a little better known. I think a lot of veterans themselves are coming up and speaking to other veterans, which I think, is something that, once you go through war, I think it's only another vet who can truly understand. So I found in talking to Vietnam vets that I know, and also in talking to younger vets, that it is that sort of passing on this sort of brotherhood of experience that has really helped. And I think we need to keep up that pressure in terms of providing our veterans with more support, both within Veterans Affairs and also outside.
Thanks so much for listening patiently. Please give a round of applause for our guest speaker. Have a wonderful day and take more Asian American Studies classes.